All right, welcome everyone back for our afternoon session on direct action and direct democracy. So we have what three really fascinating papers from Anastasia, Kavada, Tim Rivas, and Clara Lucas. And Anastasia is going to speak first, and as always, obviously, we want 3 minutes to go.
Okay. So hello everyone. So today I will be talking about the relationship between direct action and direct democracy in the movements of the squares. What I'll be saying here is based on interviews with nearly 100 activists. And my main case study is Occupy Wall Street, but then I have some shadow case studies where I have fewer interviews. That's Occupy London, Occupy Boston, Occupy Seattle. Then also the indigenous movement in Athens, which was part of the 2011 wave. It started in May 2011 after Spain. And the last movement of that, I think, wave was in France in 2016. That's the Green Debut movement that started as a protest against a new labor law that was going to parliament at the time, that was going to liberalize the labor market. So and then it sort of like it ended up in an occupation of the square, as you see here. So what you see in many of these movements, and Occupy Wall Street is an example, is that there's an initial call to protest, and that was issued by Adbusters, inspired by the Tahrir Square, calling on people to occupy Wall Street. And there was one sort of like direct grievance against the excesses of capitalism and the financial system and Wall Street. Now, actually, for the activists who were organizing things on the ground, because Adbusters is a culture jamming magazine based in Canada, they didn't do any on the ground organizing. They never thought that an occupation would be possible. So as somebody said in the interview, we planned for an assembly on September 17th. We didn't plan for an occupation. None of us believed that it was actually possible. We thought the police is going to beat us down immediately. There's no way this is going to last even a night. Maybe like 2 or 3 nights at most. But beyond that, this whole 2-month thing that Adbusters wants to do, that's definitely not going to happen. But then it did. And there was sort of like a crucial moment that a lot of people sort of like describe when it comes to the emergence, when it turns into an occupation. So in this quote, which you cannot see very well, it said that it occurred to me that we need to claim space. And to claim space, you need to ask people to sit down, because that's the ultimate symbol that we are not living. So as people were coming into the park, I got up onto a bench and I said, mic check. And then I said, please sit down, first act of occupation. And it wasn't until that moment when maybe 300 people all at once sat down in Zuccotti Park, it then occurred to me, clicked. This was real. This was a big deal. So you have a kind of sort of like preparing for a protest, but the protest turning into a long-term occupation. So what happens then, right? I think what happens is that people start to build the kind of prefigurative intentional community in those squares. And what seemed to be sort of like very central, at least in many analyses of these movements, was the kind of direct democracy that they practiced, which was based on open assemblies, and it was based on consensus decision making. But what I would like to suggest based on my research is that perhaps this is a quite restrictive understanding of democracy that is based mainly on decision-making processes. And I think that really what was happening on those squares was a drive to what I call project democracy. And this actually emerged from from an interview with Mehdi, who was an activist from Read the Book. And he said, I really believe that democracy by project could work. Someone has an idea. He was trying to describe what was happening in Place de la République in the book. Somebody has an idea, makes a proposition, and people vote for it, and they agree, and they want to help him, and then he does it. So he's owning the project. And I think that society can work with this type of democracy. It's completely reshaping the Greek democracy, reinventing it. So I suggest that we can think of democracy as sort of like a whole organizational system where people who have a political project and who have an idea can come together in order to be able to achieve that. And you actually saw that. So it goes sort of like beyond assembly decision making. And then the occupied square served as a central nodal point of this sort of like system of organizing. It was the center of decision-making because this is where the assemblies were happening. It was the center of living because this is where people were camping. And it was also the center of mediation because when the media, but also the activists' own social media were reporting on the squares, the square was sort of like a central focal point of the performance of occupying all of these movements. And then you have a kind of sort of like network of projects and working groups that had the General Assembly at the center. And this is a list of the working groups or commissions from the book. Some of them, they call them structural, which were the working groups devoted to sustaining the movement. And this could be technology, logistics, the kitchens, the facilitators, all of that. And then working groups devoted to discussion and reflection and developing sort of like the policy of the movement on different issues. And this could be justice, LGBTQ, ecology, democracy, culture, economy. So you have a sort of like the assembly at the center, but then a whole system of projects and of working together. And I would like to suggest that we have Project Democracy on the Squares operated with 7 logics. Now, these logics are aspirational. What I find in my research is many cases where in practice this was not happening. And also sometimes they were in tension with one another. And the first one obviously is equality. And that meant sort of like a radical and expansive understanding of equality that was based on equal power in both taking and implementing decisions. And this idea around horizontality and leaderfulness, I think, fits into this sort of like logic of equality. This idea that we have multiple leaders, not one central leader, and that we train people, also people who are not experienced, in taking up leadership roles. The second logic was a logic of autonomy, which means actually that the collective can make its own rules. So that relates to also some work by Ruth Kina, for example, on the constitutionalism of those kinds of movements. But I guess it was sometimes confused with this idea of libertarian individual freedom. And I think that was particularly the case in the US, but also in other countries as well. A third logic is a logic of action. So this means that there's an emphasis on doing and on work. There's an emphasis on configuration, creating a new world. There's an emphasis on implementation, not only on decision-making, but also implementing the decisions that are taken in the assembly. And experimentation, meaning trial by error, like doing stuff and trying out different things. And this also meant that because the action was valued, that people who were not experienced in taking part in decision-making, because perhaps they're not confident and they're not trained to do that, they could still join the movement and participate based on their skills. So if you knew how to cook, perhaps you could become part of the kitchen working group. But the kitchen working group was also taking decisions by consensus, which actually meant that then you became trained, through action into sort of like, you receive the kind of sort of like political education, that then you could enlarge your participation and make you perhaps more confident to also participate in general assemblies. So there was an emphasis on training and on learning by doing and sort of like expanding people's skills. A fourth logic is intersectionality and issue interconnectedness, which is what happens when you get so many diverse people on a square to try and discuss what they're about. So you see on the left a flow chart created by the artist Rachel Scruggs of the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City. And it's extremely confusing. It is meant to be very confusing. You can spend hours studying it. That actually tries to show the sort of like relations between the different sort of like statements and grievances that the movement was expressing. A fifth logic is a logic of transparency and radical openness. So you saw a kind of sort of like 24 live streaming, also of what were once considered internal sort of like decision-making meetings. So it was not only the assemblies that were live streamed and live tweeted, but also the meetings of the working groups as well. So it was a way of making the backstage, the decision-making, the front stage of the movement. So the performance was actually based on that very much. And there was a radical openness because at least in the General Assemblies, people could come off the street and participate in an assembly, which created a lot of problems. A sixth logic is a logic of care. And characteristics are based on the notion of vulnerability, that we are all vulnerable, and interdependence, that we need each other in order to survive. So that was expressed in different ways. So there was an emphasis on caring for the civic body, on the kitchens, on feeding people, clothing people, just ensure that the basic needs are covered in order to be able to then participate in the democratic and organizational system. But at the same time, there was an emphasis as well within the assemblies. You had temperature checkers, people who were asking people whether they were physically okay, emotionally fine, sort of like continuing to take decisions. So that kind of emphasis on care meant that also care work that tends to be erased was valorized a bit more, even though in actual practice, because it was undertaken mostly by women or people who didn't have other skills, sometimes people forgot about how important that work was. A seventh logic is a logic of the commons. And this is where we have this emphasis on the common production and sharing of resources, but also a common ownership of the movement itself. So it is an idea of democracy that tries to question private property effectively. And in a way, the relationship between liberal representative democracy that is very, very closely tied to private property. So the commons are considered to be not just an alternative economic system, but an alternative economic, sort of like creating really sort of like liberation, sort of like relationships between people. So there you could see an understanding of democracy as the production of the commons. So that was sort of like really important in that sense. So all of that is fine and good, but so you can consider that, occupying public space, doing direct democracy based on action as perhaps a form of direct action. And we talked about different forms of direct action here. But many of these occupations also had a direct action working group. And that the logic of a direct action group, like in Occupy Wall Street or in Occupy Boston, was slightly different. It was this idea that these groups would then organize sort of like actions beyond the square that would actually have external targets. And we saw them operating in a slightly different way than the other working groups. So they weren't as transparent, they were much more secret, and they were more closed because they had to vet their members, because sometimes they would engage in civil disobedience or something like more illegal tactics. So while, for instance, in the beginning in Occupy Wall Street, in the first couple of weeks, the direct action working group, we tried to pass decisions in the assembly around resolutions to take different actions. After a while, they were mandated by the General Assembly to operate completely autonomously and with secrecy. So you have a different way of operation, but at the same time, because there was so much emphasis on the direct democracy happening on the square, we found that these kinds of direct actions were actually marginalized. People were not so interested in that. In addition, there were so many issues that people were talking about. It was sometimes a little bit confusing to try and pick just one, or a few, or too many, in order to decide what kind of actions would be happening. So they often relied on the same tactics that then gained a kind of sort of like a ritual role. So for example, they would have this kind of spontaneous demonstrations starting from the squares, going around the city and chanting slogans, right? So it was a way of perhaps doing some kind of sort of like outreach by action. So as one activist from the Direct Action Working Group of Occupy Boston said, in a way, Occupy Direct Action wasn't really the most significant element, because Occupy, there were other ways that we tried to attract people and other ways that we did actually exert some sort of political force. The General Assembly, I think, is one way of doing that. It's one way that is radically different than what people are used to, right? So it was also the newness of that kind of tactic that attracted a lot of attention, both from people and from the media, that seemed to sort of like marginalize other types of direct action. But not all was lost, because those kinds of direct actions that went beyond the square were met with police violence. In a way, for the first few weeks at least, many of the occupations were actually tolerated by police. That meant that there wasn't so much sort of like conflict with the authorities that would create spectacular media images. 2 weeks into the occupation of Wall Street, many protesters were arrested on brutally bridge. And that made the mainstream media, it increased attention on the movement. And it actually meant that, for instance, activists from Occupy London could attract enough people to launch an occupation in London, which happened in October, like a month after Occupy Wall Street. And they told me that this was sort of like quite instrumental in doing so. And there were also, this video also went viral. It shows two women protesters being surrounded by police and mace and sort of like screaming in pain. And a lot of people who saw that video told me that this was a moment of profound radicalization where they decided, okay, I'm now going to the square, or okay, I'm now going to be organizing something in my own city. And I think what is important here to note is that even if you didn't agree with the movement, you may still want to preserve the right to protest. So this means that then you have sort of like greater support because the right to protest is being violated effectively. Now, in the last part, I wanted to talk about two outliers. So Nuit Debout, I think, was a bit of an outlier theme. And there are various reasons. Like one reason is that at the same time as everything and all of the direct action and democracy that was happening on the square, Loi Travail, the labor law, was going through parliament at the time. And that meant that this provided sort of like a lot of opportunity and a clear target for activists to organize direct action. So for instance, on the 26th of May, 2016, in Paris, they had a demonstration in front of l'Assemblée Générale, and they also tried to block some of the streets in the center of Paris. And there were similar demonstrations in other parts of France as well. So there was sort of like many actions sort of like being organized around the labor law. At the same time, as a tactic, Nuit Debout was different than other occupations because it was not a permanent occupation of the space. In the organizing of it, they had Spanish activists from 59, from 5 years ago, giving them guidance and advice. And one of the advice that they got was that once you have a permanent occupation, then the whole movement is very much hijacked by the effort to sustain the occupation. It becomes a lot about the camping and less about what the camping is about. So they had a pop-up occupation, which meant that they would set up an implementary camp at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock every day, and then they would pack everything up in one lorry at midnight. And the next day, they would do the same thing. And they would actually have a permit to do that. So every day, they would have a new permit to actually do that event. So this meant that you had a much more mobile tactic. And that was also because they were using mobile phones much more for organizing, because smartphones were more available. And also you had, everything was organized on Telegram. It moved a little bit from the emails to Telegram, which meant that you could have organizing on the go because you have your mobile phone on you like all the time. So it was a much more mobile, if you like, a pop-up occupation. And that meant that tactic could then be carried over to different kinds of occupations. So there was an occupation of the Odeon by people who were working in performance and theater and in protest to the labor law. There was, for instance, one day where instead of holding a general assembly in Place de la République, they actually moved it and they had it at Odeon because it was sort of like easier for the tactic to be movable. Another outlier is Athens. And what was very interesting in Athens, and I think, and we have a chapter on that with my friend Ursula Dimitri, and I think it's left out from a lot of accounts of the Athens indigenous, is that, and here you see sort of like an occupational rendering of something. This is in that Mall Constitution Square in the center of Athens. And if you look at how the square is arranged architecturally, you have the upper square, which confusingly is actually down here. And the upper square is elevated. You need to go down some stairs to go down to the lower square. So they're sort of like in a way divided by space, sorry. And the upper square is just opposite the parliament. So what you had was sort of like a natural division of the space. In the upper square was a stage of protest. So they were facing the parliament. You had different kinds of groups, some of them from the nationalist left, some of them from the far right as well. They were present over there. So there was sort of like much more noise. Sometimes they would be blocking the street. So this was sort of like a space of protest. And there wasn't much connection and communication with what was happening in the lower square, where you had the classic occupation, living installation, people's assembly, taking sort of like decisions by consensus. In a way, they tolerated each other and they coexisted in the same space, making up one movement but being divided in two. And what was interesting is that even online, websites that were more devoted seemed to be coming from people participating in the upper square, and those ones of the lower squares did not have links to each other. So that kind of division of space was also in the online space. So my last slide, I have no conclusion. My conclusion is a cop-out. It's a bit like a Facebook relationship status. What is the relationship between democracy and adaptation? It's complicated. What I try to show here is sort of like the different nuances in this kind of relationship that differ according to the context, according to the political goal, and all of that. So, thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much, Anastasia. Question.
I have a question. Like in my interviews with for activists, they were mentioning a lot Occupy movements of squares, especially Tahrir, the square where they were there during Arab Spring, and they were criticizing the approach because people can easily avoid the square. They don't have to go there if they don't want to see and be part of it. But also they mentioned that in authoritarian contexts, like government can easily find a way to slow down arrival of people to the square, block out the square, do the games so that people can never arrive there. I'm wondering as well, like, what do you find those kind of conversations, your interviews with activists, where they were mentioned that being on one square was actually bedding mobilization?
Yeah. And it's, so for instance, there were other ways in which you can stop work on the square in 2011, you could cut off Wi-Fi access, for example. Also, it was very difficult for a lot of the working groups to actually do any work on the square. So they started working in sort of like spaces where it wasn't that cold and they had electricity and all of that. But then this actually meant that they started operating much more autonomously. And that this was sort of extremely problematic, particularly when it came to mediatives, for example, that needed to have the kind of legitimacy of somebody who's close to the movement, which is representing the movement. So yes, that was a problem. I think in 2011 it was a new tactic, which actually meant that it was a little bit more difficult for that to be sort of like constrained. They found sort of like different ways to constrain what was happening on the squares. But for instance, in the UK, there were sort of like new laws being introduced where it made it impossible to erect structures in a public square. And that was sort of like a direct response to what was happening in Occupy. And some activists mentioned that their outreach was not great. It wasn't well organized. And partly, I think, sometimes the fact that you say, oh, we're open, come on, come in, actually hides the fact that you have to be very, very sort of like strategic around how you do outreach, because then you have very little suspects actually coming and participating. So that was, mentioned as a problem.
And one of the questions, short one, I noticed like nourishment and caring. For example, moments that they go and give blood in hospitals, take care of children and all that, but it's a more communicative, like a performative form of establishing like a legitimacy as a movement. Did they consider going outside of their circle and I don't know, what I mean, feeding the ones in need?
Well, something that as an answer relates to the previous question as well, what happened after the evictions was that in some cases they tried to sort of like establish this kind of like neighborhood associations and neighborhood assemblies as well. In Greece, I was going through austerity and an economic crisis at the time, which is something that I forgot to say was very much an anti-austerity movement. Hence, the protesting the parliament so doing directly. You had a flourishing of community clinics, community kitchens, and all of that. Like, okay, when it comes to one of the most well-known community clinics at the time, the people met at Synagogue, and they decided to do something about it. But sometimes, it wasn't sort of like as direct. But I think the logic of care became very obvious to me, because most of my interviews were with Occupy Wall Street. And in 2012, they had a Hurricane Sandy, with New York. And then sort of like they used a lot of the infrastructures that they had created as part of Occupy to do hurricane relief. And for many people, this was considered to be sort of like a mutual aid project that would sort of like was continuing the movement. And they operated with some similar organizational logics, although there were differences as well. And it's sort of like, it's interesting how they use the infrastructure, sort of like already the infrastructure of websites and social media pages and all of that. They also use the Amazon wedding registry so that people could donate blankets and torches and what have you. So sort of like it was an interesting iteration, although other people were saying, well, now Occupy has become secret. What is this, you know? So it's not that everybody agrees with all of that, but I think it's sort of like really important if we're serious about mutual aid, to think of mutual aid and care as an extremely important part of this movement. Not only in the fact that they're feeding people, but also the fact that you need to care for people in every part of the process, in every part of the organization, in how to talk to each other and how to listen to each other, in everything.
Absolutely perfect.
Thank you. I would like to follow up directly on that because as we know from the feminist political theory, there are a lot of debates in terms of to what extent is democracy gendered and the whole public-private split. And people think about to what extent could direct election be connotated as something natural. And what I wanted to ask you about is whether you wanted to say a little bit more about to what extent direct action and democracy are gendered in the squares. Then we also know that the squares are not necessarily safe spaces. So there is the dimension of care, but also of threat. And I wondered whether you wanted to tell us a bit more about.
So I've written a book chapter on care in the commons and feminist democratic theory that is sort of like focusing on the logic of care in the commons that I talk about here. And I think what feminist democratic theory really sort of like shows is that when we think of democracy, we think of the public sphere. We tend to erase both economic relations, but also what is happening in the domestic space as well. So there is an understanding of the citizen as this individual, is normally a she, who is pursuing his interests in the public sphere, and this somebody who just emerges already cared for from the private sphere, but all of the caring and the interdependence and all of that becomes erased in order to think of him as an individual, right? So there is this sort of understanding within democratic theory that I think a caring logic sort of like directly and it's sort of like a logic also within representative democracy. So I think it's pretty sort of like revolutionary in that sense. But you're absolutely right. What I like about care theory, because it can be a very broad and slippery concept, is that it focuses very much on what is happening on the ground, because care is a very practical thing. It's not something to think about, it's something you actually do. But also it helps you understand power relations by focusing on vulnerability. Like, okay, so we're all vulnerable, but we're not all vulnerable in the same way, and not everybody's vulnerabilities are taken into account. So, for instance, you mentioned that yes, they try to create safe spaces to protect particularly women, right, from sexual abuse. There were instances like that on the square, and then you have this sort of like emphasis on restorative justice and not excluding people from the movement, right? So it was very difficult to exclude people who might have been perpetrators of those kinds of abuses. And also they didn't want to to surrender them to the police either, right? So there was this sort of like kind of dilemmas, and sometimes they were solved by actually prioritizing the vulnerabilities of the people who were perpetrating that violence rather than the vulnerabilities of other people. So in a way, thinking about vulnerability, I think it's a very sort of like productive way to think about power relations. Yeah.
Or the question
I want to direct very interesting both by sharing my experience and so that time I was a student, and so I went to meet the needs of the students, and we were actually around me at that time, and already making friends here as CVs, exploring to go out to do their life, and just there and waiting for midnight drinking beers, because at midnight the police would come and try to keep us out. So we were a little bit of fire, wildlife demonstrations, so on. So we did not understand about the democratic assembly, but we were joining the direct action things, and we thought it was so fun because there was secret, and it's like, let's gather this place in we didn't really know what it was. So I think that this combination of alternative democratic system and direct action thing that you described is also a way, I think, that I can together people with very different sociological background, with different appetites for activism, and that like to sit down and think for hours on how we can rewrite the constitution. Young CD students that like just to do direct action into being clear and so that's one.
It offers, it's a full service movement, right? Offering everything to everyone. And I think that, I think what you point out is that sometimes it gets forgotten, like the conviviality, that's so important, sort of like living together with people, or sort of having these common experiences with people that you wouldn't actually meet in your everyday life. And that was sort of like transformative for a lot of people rather than necessarily participating in an assembly. Because, after the first few weeks, also assemblies were too long and too boring. And we needed to actually try to do something about it and instituted a different system, but then have a general assembly only on a Sunday. So it would be only once a week. Right, because they recognized that it was sort of like very difficult, very demanding of people to have general assemblies every day, like in other movements. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
There's a question of privilege. Who can have enough money?
Privilege, ability, because disabled people might not be like, there's also sort of like all kinds of questions around participation there.
All right, we've gone for half an hour.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.